Hey guys, welcome to week 1. I wanted to make a video because I just was working through this and had quite a long post, and I felt like with all of the reading that you guys did this week, I thought it might just be quicker and easier to give you guys a post that was video so you could just sit there, and maybe it would take a little less time so that you guys aren't spending quite as much time. And also maybe we could just get kind of hammer through some of the important points. So what I was thinking about, I kind of wanted to wait and see how this week went. I know that these readings were difficult. So what I was thinking is, from your feedback, I think each week I'm going to make a video that gives you guys some sort of context with these big readings. I know that this is a great book and it's an entire anthology collection, but sometimes anthologies can be kind of awful in that you're not seeing anything in a linear pattern, you're not understanding where these authors are coming from, it doesn't explain why they're writing, and this kind of little 3-sentence blurb here is not really enough to explain what's really going on with these authors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly go through the week 1 authors. I'm going to pull out some important points. You guys are already in the discussion forum. You're all making pretty fantastic arguments, pretty great points. I'm very, very, very impressed with week 1, especially given that we didn't have any lecture, any context. You guys were just sort of thrown out there with these huge philosophical questions. So that being said, I think you guys did great, but I think it may help if we can sort of go through some things. If I can get this posted by Monday, that gives you 2 days to finish the readings and do your Wednesday post. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do for you guys. So quickly, I want to just give you guys a couple quick notes on the authors we read. So Morris and the Concept of God. Morris is a modern scholar. So what that means is he has everyone to look back on. So Morris can build on a lot of arguments. Morris kind of has seen the interplay with people. It's a good essay to start out with. Morris is was a professor at Notre Dame. The most important thing about this reading is he's outlining method. He's basically saying there's no good way to measure perfection. There's no good way to study God. We don't have good data sets. So sure, we can go through all these thought experiments that Thomas Aquinas has. We can go back and look at what we have in Scripture. We can look at church fathers, but we don't have any scientific data. So at best, we're just guessing, and that's kind of futile. Also, he goes into a little bit of perfect being theology. I think that that's kind of important. He believes that it's sort of a miracle that there's some shared understanding of a higher deity. So he definitely he leans on the deist side for sure, or I'm sorry, on the theist side for sure, but not really making any strong argument other than, hey, we don't have good method, we're wasting our time trying. He does pull out the intrinsic versus extrinsic goodness. I think that's a huge point, especially when we're talking about this idea of perfection is good coming from within, or is good only the outcome? So is it an extrinsic good, so God only does things that have a good outcome, or it's an intrinsic good where it's good on the inside and the outcome is not, it's not reliant on the outcome. So you guys might want to take a look at that. That could back up a lot of what you guys have been posting about as well. The important points that he makes for a God is conscious God, so it has to have consciousness. It has to be a free agent. It has to be acting on its own will. It has to be benevolent. Has to be good. Has to have all knowledge. Has to have all power. Has to be a creator. And it's needed for us to exist. So that's sort of Morris in a quick wrap-up. Pinnock, the openness. This is an interesting theology. He is modern. He's what you call an apologist, which basically there was a classification of Christians, and these Christians were making it their main mission to help Christians fit into society. So he's modern. So that's a term from antiquity, but he is called a modern apologist. So basically, once upon a time, when the Romans were pagans and they were taking everyone over, the Christians were not being allowed to be participating members in society. And the reason is there wasn't any antiquity to their religion. So Judaism was allowed, but the Romans believed that to conquer a people, you had to conquer them entirely, and that meant taking their theology as well. So you had to, when you were conquered by Rome, you had to worship the Roman gods. The Romans made an exception for the Jews because their religion had great antiquity. This becomes the reason why some Christians are allowed to pass, because they're a subset or an offshoot or a reformation of Judaism. So Christians are still existing in the Roman world, but they're not fitting in well. People are still being like, oh, those crazy Christians. So what happens is Christians start coming up with great writings. They learn how to write so that Roman people will read it. They learn the language. And they write about how Christianity is not that bad. And they become what's called an apologist. So most people consider Pinnock a modern apologist. Basically, he is seeing that people are rejecting Christianity because the idea of like people going to hell who've never heard of Christianity. So like we're talking like, you know, children on islands that haven't been ever conquered, or, you know, people who grow up in another religion and never have access to Christianity. Basically, like modern Christianity was saying, you know, these people are going to hell. And people are not taking this super well at the time when he's writing. So he makes an effort in many of his writings to sort of reconcile that and come up with some answers to some hard questions. So like I said, he gets branded an apologist. The main thing from what we're reading from him is he comes up with the idea, because people are saying, well, if God knows everything, God knew how poorly this was going to go. And so if God knew how poorly this is going to go and didn't intervene, like a lot of this is on God's hands, right? So he's basically saying that God knows that it's not linear. So basically God knows this part, but God also knows that if you take a right turn here and you go out this way, you will be up here. And if from the line you take this turn, you're going to... So basically he makes the argument that God knows all possible outcomes. And it's this notion that we're going to get in another author of free will that decides which branch comes to fruition. So what he sort of becomes is what we call an open theist. And an open theist is kind of breaking things open that have been church narrative for years, like the idea, like the linear timeline. God knows the beginning and the outcome, and that's just how it is. He basically says there is no divine simplicity. It's way too complicated. He says that God, to be a fair and a just God, has to drastically, I think he says radically, limit his power to be in relationships with humans. So basically he says that it's not that God couldn't stop this, it's that God feels an ethical obligation to limit his power to allow humans some agency in the world. Which is a really, very interesting way to go, and very interesting nod to like this author becomes kind of one of the forefathers of open theology. He says the future's unknowable, God knows all possible outcomes, but God doesn't manipulate or force an outcome. He basically makes the argument that should God do that, he would be a manipulative, bad God, and that he's not going to do that. So basically, like, he is leaning heavily on free will. He is the one that makes the argument that says that God does let us impact him, or God does let us impact God. He gifts people power. God helps God does acknowledge that there are evil forces in the world, which I think is interesting because Pinnock doesn't say what. So Pinnock just says God acknowledges that this is happening, but Pinnock doesn't cite anything that say what he's talking about. So we don't really know, but that is a crux of his writing. What I think that we get from him is the answer to our discussion post, so I'm not going to quite bring it out, but he does talk substantially about, God making voluntary decisions, and God gifting people agency, God gifting people power, God gifting people free will, God gifting people kind of everything that God could have kept. So that was a good reading, especially for this question. So the one thing I want to bring out, though, is that both of these authors they sit from a position of being in privilege because they're writing in the 50s through the 80s. So they have everybody else that we read's arguments. They have what everybody else is thinking, what everybody else is saying. So, yeah, they're going to come up with some of the best answers. So, yes, that's probably why this book had us read them first, is because they at least give a coherent answer. Because I don't know that the same can be said for, Augustine or Aquinas. So we move from there into Tillich, Reality of God. This is going to be more in the 1900s, but most of his writing does come in the 60s. So he does have some of these other authors to engage with and work with. What I think is really odd about Tillich is he sort of makes the argument as God is the highest being, but that God is still a being. And I think that that's interesting because he basically says if you are something, you can't be the source of something. Which this is pretty easily refuted in philosophy, but it's a really interesting place that he takes a theological point. So he basically says if God is a being, then God is what beings are modeled after, but not the source. Because, not the creator, but the source. So, I think that's interesting. God is experienced, defined, and related to as a being. So he also makes the point that you can react, interact, and relate as a being, as a conscious being. So that's interesting because Morris sort of expounds upon that and says that God has to be conscious, so God has to be a being. I think so Tillich becomes like a forefather of systematic theology. And what that basically means is that there becomes this push for theologians to sort of start to organize themselves. Basically, what's happening is in the field of theology, in the study, people are saying this is too much church history and there's no systems for us to organize ideas, for us to organize people outside of the Holy Roman Church. And Tillich pushes back on that and says, you know what, I think we can organize our ideas just fine. But the reason why is Tillich is a philosopher. So this is going to be one of the more philosophy-heavy readings. This is not theology-heavy. This is very philosophy-heavy. So basically, he takes all the philosophy that's behind many theologies. He uses them, he organizes them, and then he comes up with, some arguments. But he doesn't really come up with a lot of strong arguments. What he really does is organize things. So that's his contribution. Interesting reading, definitely more modern, helpful for us to understand. Also, I don't think anything that you guys need to lose any sleep over. So then we take a really, really right-hand turn and we end up with Sen. And we're talking about, Brahma. We're talking about, he's modern. So Sen does have all of the other authors as well to use. But he's writing from the social location of a Hindu author. This is fascinating, really. He's writing from, Vista University. What Sen does here is basically makes an argument that that we could be all talking about, everyone in philosophy could be talking about the same God. And that is a fascinating point, and he makes it compellingly, I think. I mean, feel free to disagree if you guys wish. But I think he makes a very compelling point. So he talks about, basically, Hinduism has two holy books, right? So you've got one holy book, you've got another holy book. And they're very different stylistically, but they're put together. It's almost if we have a lot of Christians in this class, so let's relate it back to, it's like if you took the Old Testament and you took the New Testament. Now these are like different writings. They're coming out of way different times. One of them's much more Jewish in nature, obviously the Hebrew Bible. One of them is mostly Paul's writing, much more modern. And you put them together, you smash them together, and it becomes one book. And that's more or less what happens in Hinduism as well. When this happens, there's a part of Hinduism that seems like it's very polytheistic, so it's talking about lots of gods. And there's a part that's talking about just Brahma. And Brahma is the source of everything. So Brahma is unknowable, all-powerful, omnipotent. So Brahma sounds a lot like our construction of God, right? Or, sorry, when I say our, Christians' construction of God. Western construction of God. So, how does that reconcile is sort of what Sen's work is doing. How does that reconcile with a tradition that most people, if you ask them, they'd say Hinduism is polytheistic. And what he basically says is that we know for sure that Brahma is the source of everything, and what these other gods that are mentioned in the other holy book are saints, angels. He uses a lot of the like Western construction words to help make the point. Like he's definitely writing this for Westerners or Christians or Jewish scholars. And he does it well. And he basically says that this conceptual thought that Westerners have is the same conceptual thought that the Hindu religion holds for Brahma. And what happens is, Brahma creates everything, and then humans and the world sort of socially orient themselves. And Brahma has like a loving role in this, but not an intervening role. So that's an interesting concept because, how can you be loving and not intervene in suffering? He doesn't really address that, but also it wouldn't make sense for him to address it because Hinduism, suffering is actually part of your elevation. So Hinduism, the kind of final attainment is oneness with Brahma. And how you get to that is by advancing levels, more or less, in lifetimes of your soul. And sorry, this is very loose. Please, no one be offended. I'm just trying to kind of hammer us through it quickly. So don't think that I'm just, dumbing down a religion or making it too basic. I know that it's far more nuanced than I'm making it sound. But the argument that you're making these escalations and then finally what happens is you become one with Brahma. So Hinduism more or less says that this suffering is needed to create the advancement. So that's how they sort of deal with suffering in the world, while maintaining a loving creator. So that's Sen. Okay, so like I said, we were on sort of a track and then we went over here and then the book's trying to bring us back. And the book brings us back with Aquinas, which was a weird choice, but a good one to read. So Thomas Aquinas, every single person who's ever studied religion is going to be familiar with Aquinas. He is a forefather of the church. He is sainted. He is the one that basically says, you know, like the church better catch up and we better be like putting out good intellectual thoughts so that we can compete with sort of the science ages. Aquinas is writing in about the 1300s, so that's why, you know, this is sort of the age of enlightenment, more or less. So that's why his concern is so much like, you know, we have to make these arguments, we have to do this, we have to put a point out that makes sense and lives side by side with science. He is hard to read. This is from the Summa Theologica. Basically, so it's written in Latin, so it's already translated once, and it's difficult. And then he makes this weird choice to write everything. I mean, it's not weird for his time. It's very, very logical for his time. This is how everyone who was writing academically was writing in his time. But basically, there's an argument, points, a rebuttal, and then like a second rebuttal sometimes, and then a third rebuttal. So how he's structuring this makes it very difficult for us to be reading modern day because he's arguing with himself. He's just talking back and forth. He's saying, and he's taking this from what science, what philosophers, what psychologists, like he's taking this from what the scientists of his time are saying. And so he's presenting their arguments. He's saying, here's what people are saying. Here's what I'm saying. Here's their rebuttal that I actually made better because I kind of helped their rebuttal because I'm Thomas Aquinas. And then he's saying, and here's the final answer. So this style, difficult to read, but it tends to make him pretty concise. So that's nice. That cut down a couple pages on your reading. It also tends to make his points like very easy to pull out and say, you know, Thomas Aquinas is just talking about God's limited power. He's talking about if God made a rock, could God lift the rock? And fascinatingly enough, like since Aquinas has done this, we've been talking about it. So to this day, in most religion classes, you will be asked the question, can God make a rock so heavy that God can't lift the rock? And people will go back and forth. And Aquinas doesn't really give us a strong philosophical answer. Aquinas gives us, yes, of course God could make the rock, and then yes, of course God could lift the rock. So that's kind of how Aquinas, like he talks himself into a little bit of circles. But he also is, I mean, he's very faithful. He just says like, yeah, God, of course, that's just how it is. So a lot of his writing is that way. An interesting choice that we made was to skip. Oh, one more note on Aquinas. I don't know if you guys caught this or if anyone told you, but when he's talking about the philosopher constantly, he is talking about Aristotle. So if any of you were sitting there being like, what is he talking about? He is basically making arguments against Aristotle's ancient writings. So Aquinas is writing 2,000 or 3,000 years after, well, not even that, really that far, but he's writing long after Aristotle, but he's making a nod towards Aristotle because Aristotle's considered the father of most great thought. So Aquinas is saying, I love and appreciate the philosopher, and here's the things that I think I need to sort out that he's done wrong. Okay, that's Aquinas. So we skipped the Buddhist reading, which I thought was really interesting. I don't get to select the readings for this class. I more or less just get to help facilitate the discussion and the papers. But they decided to skip the Buddhist reading. We go into some Buddhism later in the class, so don't be disappointed. But it's a reading about oneness, more or less. So it goes into a lot of what I was talking about in Hinduism. Buddhism is actually a reformation of Hinduism, so they have very similar creation ideas. Okay. And then we get into our puzzles. So we get into Maveros. Modern writer addressing evolution. So this author, again, is trying to reconcile Christianity with some of the modern pushback. So writing from a place of everyone at the time is up in arms about creation versus evolution, because we're talking about whether we're going to teach it in schools. So he tries to tackle that issue. So the reason that he's writing is to talk about evolution. And the reason that he's writing is to sort of propose a creationist version of evolution. So pretty simple. He talks a lot about Aquinas and cites Aquinas, cites some of the ancient authors. He cites some of the Greek philosophers. And what he comes up with is more or less what Morris comes up with, except for more specific. So he says that we do not have any good tests for omnipotence. So basically he's like, you can't put God in a double bind, and then, which a double bind is like two impossible, non-compatible ideas, and then that's your scientific test. He's like, that doesn't work. That thought experiment is flawed. It's not helpful. It's not advancing anything. He is basically saying, just like Morris said, hey, we don't have a good method, but he's saying, he takes that one step further and says, hey, we don't have a good method to test omnipotence. We are sitting here talking about God lifting rocks, and I don't know why. I don't know why we're still talking about this, is basically what he's saying. But he does make very strong arguments for God directing evolution. So, he's saying, evolution is not incompatible with creationism. Let's stop freaking out, and let's stop trying to test God's power with these weird thought experiments. Let's just accept that we don't have a good test. Let's start thinking of some new tests, he even kind of says. So that's what he brings to the table. Helpful. Okay, then we go back way to the very beginning. Not the very beginning, but the very beginning of modern church thought. And we've got Augustine. So Augustine is definitely considered one of the fathers of the church. Absolutely. He is, you could make an argument that he and his ideas formed the modern church. Everything stems from Augustine. And so what we're talking about is divine foreknowledge, and this idea that, more or less, Augustine comes up with the idea of free will. So we get free will nowhere else. Nowhere in the Bible do we really have free will. We know that people are sinning, but there's not a name for it. No one's coining this name until Augustine. No one's walking around talking about free will. This is not people in, the 400s are going to their church and their bishop is standing up and saying, blah, 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 free will. That doesn't happen until this writing. And what goes on with Augustine is he's a bishop. Okay. So, he is called upon he's a bishop in Rome, and he's called upon by, not in Rome, but in the Roman Empire. He's a bishop of Hippo. So he's called upon by the Roman Emperor, Constantine, to come to some consensus. Basically, what's happening is the Roman Empire is huge, and some people up here are teaching this, and some people down here are teaching this, and some people over here, they're more Jewish, so they're teaching this, and some people over here, they're teaching this, and everybody's using a different canon. So we don't have one book that's the Bible yet. Everyone, some people are saying, we're only reading Paul, and some people are saying, hey, I want to read the Jewish scriptures. And so the church it's not coherent. And so what the Roman Empire says is, hey, if we're because by this time Rome has become Christian, and there's as a nation state. So they're saying, hey, if we're going to do this, if we're going to be Christian, it has to make sense. It has to stand up to philosophy, and we have to do that by making things the same across the board. So making things the same across the board requires people who are church heads getting together in one place, voting on what they're going to teach, voting on a calendar, voting on how it's going to be done, and voting on these hard questions, because the Roman and Greek philosophers are the foundation of this country that's now become Christian. And most Roman people are very familiar with the Plato's, Aristotle, Socrates. This is like who they're growing up reading. So they're going to have questions because they grew up reading philosophers. Also, there was a lot of very strong philosophers that came out of the Roman tradition. So what happens is Augustine says, yes, I would be glad to facilitate and help with this conference. So they all meet up, all the church heads that are Roman bishops meet up, and they have what's called the Council of Nicaea. This is where the first time they all vote on what is going to be the canon, which the canon means the collection of books that becomes the Bible. So from that we get the modern Bible. From that we get the Nicene Creed, which I'm sure many of you have grown up in churches saying. It's sort of where you say, you know, I affirm this, I affirm this, I affirm this. They basically said, you know, like, gosh, I know we all disagree on many things, but what is the foundation that we can agree on? And let's make that. And so they say, like, we agree this, we all agree this, they vote, good, it becomes Christianity. So his main contribution to this whole thing, other than, you know, helping develop the canon, is to bring in the notion of free will. Because what philosophers are saying is, I don't understand how God could let this happen. How is God letting what's going on? You know, keep in mind that most of these people are Romans or people who were completely conquered and almost annihilated by Rome, saying, I don't know that I believe that there's an omnipotent God, an all-powerful God that would allow all this. This is pretty awful here. So they basically, Augustine comes up with the idea of human free will. And he basically says, you know, that God gifted us this free will, and that's why things are allowed to happen. And then he gets a lot of pushback. And what the pushback causes him to create is the notion of original sin. So original sin, and like I said, these terms were not around until he kind of writes and coins them. So original sin comes from Augustine, and that's the notion that once humans... So he basically comes up with the fall narrative and says that, you know, once humans were asked to leave the Garden of Eden, from then on out, all of their descendants would be born into a sinful nature. And this is pretty brilliant, because if you think from Augustine all the way through to, I mean, even Aquinas is agreeing with most of what he's saying. So really all the way into like World War II era, no one has anything to say to Augustine. So whatever, I mean, when you're reading this, like, keep in mind that not only was this some of the most brilliant writing that's coming out of his time, this is like something that people couldn't argue with or couldn't come up with great debates on for years. So, you know, people may have written against Augustine or written back to Augustine or rebutted, but nothing really sticks. That being said, it's hard to read because, you know, he's like talking to his pupil. And basically, who Augustine's talking to one of his students. And the reason that he sets it up like this is because if you remember many of the ancient Greek writers, and, you know, you're looking at like, so, you know, when you're thinking about Plato and Socrates, they very much believe in like a student, professor, pupil relationship. And when he's writing this, he's sort of keeping this in mind, that this is the kind of thing that A, the people that he's arguing against are used to reading. B, it's the style of reading that everybody in Rome is going to understand, acknowledge, and have no issues with. And 3, I think that he's keeping in mind that this is a style of writing that he's seen last through generations. And that's what he's attempting to do, is to make it last. So he sets up this pupil-professor conversation where he sort of speaks from authority and answers the hard questions. And the pupil is sort of set up to be asking the questions that maybe like an average Roman person would, or a like early Roman philosopher might be asking. And then, Augustine answers from a place of church authority. So he is very big. He's probably the first person that like pushes the idea of grace. He put, like I said, grace is what he uses to answer original sin. He comes up with a really, it's not in this reading, but he comes up with like a really compelling sort of link between grace, original sin, and free will, and, the Jesus story where, basically God humbles God's self to become human, right? And then provides grace from that, because he's like solving the free will issue of how people then get to heaven if they're born original sinners. So really, really, really good stuff here. Also really, really, really hard to read stuff. Really difficult. This is, people do their doctoral dissertations on these readings that you guys are doing. So important to remember that. I know a couple of you said, I felt really in over my head. We wrap up with Pike, and Pike's modern. I think that Pike is actually going to go better with the chapter that's right after him, because they sort of are two modern authors arguing against each other instead of Pike. Pike gets a huge advantage here because Pike decides to use all of these ancient authors who can't answer back and make arguments against them, which is fair. Like, no one's been arguing with Augustine for all this time, so let's hear it. Let's hear something. And he takes, like, more or less what he does is he is synthesizing arguments and saying, like, I don't really agree. He more or less says that if a human is created and if action is created, then no human action is involuntary. Is voluntary. So human action is involuntary. Human action is directed by God, whether it's directed personally or like directed just by the nature of, because God is God. And if you're holding that God is all powerful, then you can't all of a sudden say that God doesn't have a hand in some things. He also makes a really odd point, and this is going back to like some of the like, can God lift a heavy rock arguments, is so people talk about, can God know a falsity? So, right, we spend a lot of time on all-powerful, and we don't spend a lot of time on all-knowing, but a lot of philosophers do spend a lot of time on all-knowing, and they talk themselves into circles of this, like, if you don't know so they use marriage proposal. If you are going to say no to a marriage proposal, and God knows this, but in the time you believe that you're going to say yes, and God knows this, can God know both your yes and the no outcome? And I think that this, like, a good place to bring back in, like, the branching idea, I think that's, like, when Pinnock makes that argument, I feel like he's sort of addressing that, and he's using that foreknowledge, that piece of foreknowledge, like, logic test, by saying, yeah, like, there's branches of reality, anything can happen. The other argument that Pike makes is that God stands outside of time. So for God, there is no time. It's not linear. So, like, yes, God can know both things at once because God is not in this linear mode. God is in the everywhere mode of time. But where a lot of people got hung up for years was that would be God knowing a falsity. And if God knew a falsity or believed a falsity to be true, then God couldn't be all-knowing. So that's a good amount of Pike is spent sort of sorting through and coming up with like little odd arguments to these logic tests. And I think unless you understand that the history of philosophy of religion has been these weird little nuanced logic tests, a lot of what he's saying doesn't make sense because you're like, why is he talking about this? This is such a random, like, hypothetical situation. But these hypothetical situations, to place them in the line of Christian thought, have been very important. And they've been like the thing that people have spent all their time answering. So for Pike to spend time on this, if you just read this out of context, wouldn't make sense at all. So I'm sure you guys are thinking, God, what in the world is this guy doing? But in the history of the church, it makes sense. So that's just to kind of clear that up for you guys. Also, he like goes into this idea of before, and how God lives outside of time, and if God lives outside of time, then how can there be a before God? And his argument is sort of like, you guys better come up with an answer, unless God is outside of time, which most scholars have already said. So it gets a little weak there. I don't know. I think that Pike is a great reading. I don't think Pike brings a lot to the conversation unless you have already done all of the Augustine Aquinas, even before that, sort of, studying, thinking, reading, and we don't have the time really to be doing that. So while I think it's great to have Pike, I think what he does is kind of what our first two authors do, and that's synthesizes important things, comes up with some possible answers, but mostly like gives you, this is what's been said, this is what else has been said, this is my like little input. So he almost does like these modern authors almost do the Thomas Aquinas thing of, this is what people think, this is what I think, this is the rebuttal. So that's helpful, and I hope that you guys found that useful. That being said, keep in mind that what they're basically doing is just situating us. So they're taking us and saying, you don't have time to do all these readings, but like, here's what people think, and here's a little thought for you guys to enjoy that's mine. So that is kind of the quick rundown of this week's readings. I don't want to take much more of your guys' time because I know that you have already done a ton, but I do want to assure you that I'm going to go through right now and I'm going to make one of these for next week so that you can maybe watch this beforehand and it's not like some great like, oh, well, if I'd have known that, like I maybe would have done this. The other thing, I had a point for you guys that I wanted to, the reason that I think that we need to sort of situate ourselves in the question of nature of God is people get very hung up on how there can be tragedy in the world. So when we're talking about, is God perfect? If so, why would God create the world? I don't know that everybody really, like, that's everybody's, like, true desire to know. But the line of thinking that comes from this question is the line of thinking that is tragedy exists and we have an all-powerful God. So it's sort of the great, like, where is God question. And I think that's important for you guys to know that that's kind of where this line of questioning ends up, because I think it's where a lot of you started. And I'm sure it's going to be where like a lot of people that you're interacting with start. So we've kind of just touched the iceberg. You guys have gotten some very great church fathers and their answers on it. You've gotten some really good modern authors who are in the field and are taking the like sort of tedious time to sift through everything and put it together and give some good modern thought. So I hope that this was helpful to get you guys thinking. If nothing else, it starts us in the deep end and we can swim backwards from there. Next week's going to get a little bit easier because one thing, like there's not a right answer to what we're talking about this week. Don't feel like there is. And if I do give you any pushback or, say like, well, if this, then this, please don't take it as like me arguing with you or me, criticizing or me disagreeing with your thoughts. It's just sort of the nature of this course. It's sort of the challenge of the first discussion is, present these ideas and then understand that everything you say leads down a track. So yeah, as you're reading my responses, no one please feel like that. I'm going to try to respond to everyone this afternoon. But I do want to thank you guys. Like I said, this went a lot better than I was ever expecting. Oh, the other thing, I've already done it to one person in the discussion forums, but I do just want to tell you, I know that what I explained in the very beginning of class with the gods, was difficult for a lot of people. So I have done like, if I see it in someone's discussion post, I just pull out the paragraph and then I go through and like put the correct usage in bold so that you guys can see it and just get used to it. It's never going to be anything that I slam you on in grades or anything, but I think what most of you said in your introductions is, I'm taking this class so that I can be more sensitive, so that I can help my patients, so that I can understand people of different backgrounds. And so I just sort of wanted to like give you guys that usage. So should you ever have to be writing anything, you have a comfort level with knowing, this is a way that I can say it that's not ever going to be offensive. So please don't take offense to me helping with that. Because it's certainly not a giant correction. It's just a small convention, like piece of convention for you guys. Okay, so I think that should help. Sorry, tried to keep it at 45 minutes. We went a little bit over, but next week I will do my best to stay short for you guys and still give you as much information as I can. If you guys listen to the lectures, I hope those were helpful. I didn't know often what was sort of coming out of that, but I do think like he gives a good history, if nothing else, a quick and easy history of philosophy of religion. So I feel like he sort of situates the course and says like, this is why people are doing philosophy of religion instead of just becoming theologians or philosophers. So enjoy those, but don't be stressed. Don't be stressed if this is too much. If you guys feel like it's too much, give me some feedback. Call me, shoot me an email, and let's see what we can work through to make sure that everybody's, feeling comfortable, feeling not overwhelmed. Even if you guys are feeling overwhelmed, I don't think you're doing poorly. I think you guys are doing really well. And I'm really, really pleased with everything I've seen so far. So keep up the great work. Glad to have seen all of your guys' hard work, all the great posts that came out of this week. And I'm really excited to be engaging with the rest of you in the discussion forum as we go forward. So plan on hearing from me by Monday, if not earlier. And I will also, as soon as the week closes, get your guys' grades posted and reach out to me with anything at all. Have a good rest of week one. Engage with each other. Offer pushback with each other. Provide any sort of insights that you guys come up with. And good luck with the end of the week and starting out week 2. All right, bye.